You want to go into the other next? All right, so DAC role. So first we thought we'd just ground ourselves in what does the law, what does statute say? What do DACs have to do? What do we know to be true? And so it's established in statute, but it's really, there's nothing in statute about renewals, just in new charter applications. I can say that, like, for my district, it is named in our district policy for renewals that the board may ask DAC for their input. So, even though it's not a state statute, there's something in my district saying you may want their input. And so I think part of that is, as authorizers, we also have to look at what's happening in our own context, because there may be things naming if the DAC has to be part of it or not. Advisory only, I think that's the piece of, whether or not they give a yay, nay, considerations to the board and the authorizers to consider, but they're not ultimately a decision maker. Districts have a lot of autonomy in how they structure the local approach. And then obviously the district policy details. Tom, would you add to that?
Yeah, hope everybody can hear me okay. So I guess, as we mentioned, there's not a whole lot of guidance in statute around how districts are supposed to function. There's zero mention of how districts or DACs are supposed to function in renewals, as been mentioned. I think there's one line in statute about the role of the DAC is, I think, how it's pulled up. But the role of the DAC is on new applications. And it basically just says who's supposed to be on the DAC, but it doesn't really say what happens, right? So sometime back, I think I shared it with Alex, it's probably really stale now, but sometime back I did a little thumbnail survey of some of our surrounding districts and said, what does your DAC do with regard to charter applications, and what's the process? And it was all over the map. Some DACs don't do anything. Some DACs are pretty heavily involved. For example, in Jeffco, a couple of years ago, the DAC established a charter review subcommittee of a much larger DAC. That charter review subcommittee took it upon itself to come up with its own rubric, with its own interview process. They said, no, we don't want to just be advisory. We want to make a recommendation to the board. And so there are some DACs that are quite active, quite busy when it comes to those kinds of things. That can be good, that can be not so good. We'll talk about some scenarios in both directions here in just a little bit. Suffice it to say that there isn't a whole lot of direction in statute or elsewhere when it comes to DAC function. So that's the ground rules that we're working from. So we talk about the different roles of the DAC. As mentioned, we're just all over that. Sometimes we have DAC members serve on a district's internal review. So in Douglas County, when I was there, please, Douglas friends, jump in. We attempted to have DAC members actually on the internal review team. The rationale there was to have everybody on the same page from the get-go. I don't know if we're still doing that in Douglas County or not, but that's something that we tried that I think was fairly successful. We had some DAC members, ask pretty pertinent questions and some pretty pointed questions, which was part of the whole internal review. We figured the DAC was part of the internal review. Other folks might say, as they do in Jefferson County, no. The role of the DAC is to bring in an outside community review. That's why we're outside of your internal review. So, who knows where that ends up. The way it's supposed to work, and again, I'll speak to Jefferson County, the way it's supposed to work in Jeffco is that the charter subcommittee does their interviews, does their review, makes a recommendation to the full DAC. The full DAC is then supposed to make some kind of a recommendation or report to the Board of Education. In the past, that has not worked very well because the full DAC doesn't know, and they just sort of take the word for it of the subcommittee and say, whatever you guys think, you look at it, go for it. We've also had trouble with timing in terms of DAC meetings versus board meetings and this and that. They don't always line up. And then one of the things that we want to talk about with you all a little bit is conflicts of interest. That's one of the scenarios that we're going to go after here in just a little bit. You've got folks on the DAC who have an axe to grind, either pro or con. How do you handle that? How do you keep DAC members in their lane, given that there's no definition of what the lane is? So some of those things we want to discuss with you a little bit more. Amelia, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I would say, a big piece with DACs also depends on sort of their functionality within the district and how working in a variety of different districts, sometimes DACs are very, very involved. And it is around keeping them in their lane. And then there are other times where DACs are they are sort of there as a symbol to some degree, not really involved. You're begging them to get input or to sort of follow the process that is outlined within the district with not a lot of engagement. And so recognizing, and we'll talk about some of these pieces embedded in the scenarios, but the functionality of the DAC really is and seems to be, from my different experiences, very, very different depending on the district. So I do think understanding that, within your district, what's your process, and then how do you navigate your DAC within that is something we all need to figure out.
Great. So again, we kind of touched on some of these things a little bit, depending on what district you're in, and Mary Ann, please jump in if you like. Also, Miriam. Some DACs say that they want to provide some kind of a report or even a recommendation to the Board of Education on the new charter application. Sometimes they will be part of an internal review, sometimes they won't. Sometimes they have their own rubric, sometimes they don't. So the question is, if you have a DAC that wants to present a recommendation on approval to the board, my question would be, apart from getting myself in trouble for asking the question, my question would be, where do you have the authority to do that? Where in statute does it say that the DAC makes a recommendation on charter approval to the board? We don't find it anywhere. So I think I would push a little bit on that. If you have a really active DAC that really wants to kind of go out of left field and go their own way, I think I would push on that a little bit. So sometimes DACs, one of the ways that I like is to do pluses and deltas with a DAC is to say, what strengths did you see? Okay, put on your community, if you're representing the outside community, you're not part of the internal review. Put on your community hat, what pluses and deltas did you see in the application? Apart from things where DACs very often want to go, which is, well, it's going to hurt my neighborhoods. Or the neighborhoods who are already under enrolled, this is going to make it worse. And what about the financial implications for the district? Those are questions that DACs sometimes want to ask, which are actually outside the purview of reviewing a new charter application. And we find that to be, everybody's nodding at me. We find that to be the case very often. And then number 4 on this slide, if you've got a DAC that wants to do a yes or no, and yes with the following concerns, how do you weave that into an internal review that staff has done using a standardized rubric with subject matter expertise in internal reviews? Other folks want to jump in on that?
One consideration I would just add that is alive and well in my district is the DAC has folks who have historically been part of that subcommittee, but they're also predominantly parents of kids in charter schools. And so we've had the same people doing reviews as part of the DAC or being part of renewals as part of the DAC. I don't sort of think there's a risk in and of that of itself. It's just, I think, a conflict of interest when they're so connected to what's already gone on with new applications and renewals. And I think that diversity of perspective is something that, we've been on the DAC for a long time and we've been part of the subcommittee. We're not getting fresh voices. So I think like that's a conflict of interest that might not be as clear cut. But I do think like there could be some concerns if we don't have, other people on the DAC participate. It's the same people year over year.
Yeah, we have some similar components in Aurora Public Schools. It's the same, probably 4 people. We try to get some new folks and we present to the DAC and try to get them involved, but they're getting full engagement has been difficult. So thinking through when you don't have full engagement, are there ways that you can engage them in meaningful ways that are a bonus add? I do, something that we do is we have our schools in renewal or new school applications actually present to the DAC so that they're all receiving some of that information. But with regards to renewals, we don't do that. But thinking through how do we, some of the wonderings that I have is, are there ways to pare down the renewal process? Because it is very overwhelming, especially if you have DAC members who don't really understand the full scope of educational programming, for example, or they don't understand special education. And how do you, as a district, potentially provide information to help them understand it if they're going to review the entire application without influencing their decision? I do think that there are risks when a DAC provides a recommendation to the board if they're not knowledgeable in all areas. But I do think there is value in having them understand from a community perspective on what on a renewal or a new school application. But it is something to think about how and what that looks like.
On this slide, I want to point out item number 4, just as a potential pitfall for a DAC that wants to provide a written recommendation or a formal recommendation to Board of Education on a charter application. If that is formal, that becomes, as number 4 says on the slide here, that's actually including this, that can become part of the record of appeal. And if I were an attorney who was representing a charter school that had a positive recommendation from staff, but a negative recommendation from the DAC, and that went to the state board, I would jump all over that negative recommendation from the DAC as being outside of their purview, outside of their authority. They have no statutory authority for making that recommendation. And on that basis, I would seek to have that Board of Education recommendation not to approve overturned and sent back to the board. So it's just a cautionary note there for DACs that really want to have a formal voice in the process. Anything else on this slide anybody wants to mention?
The considerations, I think, again, it's like focusing on the merits of the application. We've talked with our DAC the past several months about, kind of going back to what Tom said, like personal ideologies, or what does this mean for my neighborhood school? Like, those are not the things that we're considering right now. It's the brass tacks of what is in the application, whether it's new or renewal, and that objective perspective that you have to apply to it. Are they doing what they said they were doing? And do we have the data to support that? I think that's really what we're looking at right now. And then, let's see. Yeah, considerations of other schools are generally of limited relevance. I would even say, like, I think one thing we're considering is how much of historical considerations need to be brought into current renewals, because there's some things that are probably valid that we still need to wrestle with. But if a charter has laid to rest a concern in the past, is that something we continue to bring up, or is it, again, we need to shelve that and move forward if it's no longer a concern?
If folks have questions, folks who are online, please go ahead and put it in the chat. I know the chat's being monitored. We'll take a crack at those questions as they pop up. So if you do have a question, please pop it in the chat.
I would, if I can just add one point, I do think the part about the standard of appeal is worth bringing up, because the standard of appeal that the state board is supposed to bring in addition to looking at quality authorizing practices, is it in the interest of the pupils, the school district, or the community? And so, like DAC has that stand, they really are. They can argue that they are a representation of that community interest. And so I think if you interpret that sentence from the Charter School Act loosely, then the DAC has a very legitimate role to play in determining what's best for the community. If in a perfect world, that's how it played out.
So these come from DPS. I don't have, Alex, if you want to share, because I know
Sure, I would
just do have context. For me.
Yeah, let me give context on these ones. Denver Public Schools has so much chartering going on, and their DAC has been involved for a long time. And so one of the things DPS has done is a training for the DAC members during the application review process. And these were just generally the sort of advice they give to the DAC before they dive in, and to explain the biases that they've seen during reviews previously. So, the first one is really about thinking about us all either good or all bad, and having very absolutist thinking about a school when it's usually more nuanced. The second one is comparing it to your own expectations instead of what's in the rubric. And so someone can have very high expectations and they just don't think the school's going there, and that's not what they were thinking about. The other part is whatever was the biggest deal most recently dominates their discussion, even if it wasn't the most important topic. The other one is just norming expectations within them. And you can have very rigorous, strict graders involved in the DAC, and you can have really loose stuff. So norming can be really hard. The other part is really thinking about it in terms of the ecosystem. And this is where they're more concerned about its impact on other schools and on the school itself, which isn't a bad thing for a community leader to care about, but is a hard thing to use in a charter appeal. And then the other one is really sort of thinking about the applicant's potential instead of what they've actually written, and sort of creating things in their own head that are not what's written and that they can't act on. And that can be both positive and negative in terms of their appraisal. So these are ones DPS has used for the last few years, which I think are worth bringing into your own DAC trainings.
All right, so we have 4 scenarios. I'm just looking at the time. I don't think we'll have time to get through all 4. Do they have a soft copy of these, or is it in?
I can add it now, and there's, we can show the hard copies here,
Yeah.
and it should be on the screen at least.
Okay, on the screen. So what we're gonna do is we'll take 10 minutes per session, or per scenario is what we were thinking. We'll read through it, observations, questions, recommendations. These are compilation of current or recent experiences people have had. They're not necessarily resonant of just one experience, but they are definitely things that are applicable to what some of us are going through now. This is meant to be a collaborative. Now we take 2 minutes, read through it, independently think about what your takeaways, observations, some questions or recommendations you have, and then we'll come back together as a whole group and talk through it. We'll come back in about 30 seconds. 3, 2, and 1. And now it's really intending just to have an open conversation. What are observations that people have as they were reading through this scenario? What struck you, maybe resonate with you? Feel free just to come off mute, because some of us are online and some of us aren't. So we won't be able to see hands up.
This is Max from TPS. I think one thing that's sticking with me is Tom's recommendation of advising the DAC on how their report can be integrated as part of a state appeal. So I think just advising them on the likelihood that arguments around impact on other schools as well as related to private funding, that those are two things that are likely not going to get any traction on the state board, and that ultimately sort of could be self-defeating from whatever perspective they're trying to come from.
Well, the other thing gets thrown out, potentially just don't charter schools on the committee. I mean, kind of violating the statute. Clearly there. So that's trouble. I'm troubled by can't get into it in the scenario, but just because there's a funding group behind them. Oh, well.
Yeah, I will add its current talking point amongst the hardcore anti-charter people to blame it all on a few hedge fund billionaires and say this is just another billionaire's charter school. When the Walton connection is so tenuous.
Sort of a subset of the criticism of the funder in this scenario is not for a wrench in the works here, because we didn't talk about this with our team, but if there are objections not to the funder, but to the sponsor. This is a national outfit that's coming in to take over our schools, and they just want to put a school on every corner and have a network and this, that, and the other thing. And we don't need that here in our community. So I don't know if that changes anybody's analysis or not. Their objection frequently with folks, not so much about funding, but about outside, non-Colorado organizations, EMOs, CMOs, coming in and establishing a network of schools. And having control over them. So I don't know if that changes anybody's analysis or not.
Well, there's somebody in the college trying to deal with that, but she was this morning. I'm sure.
Well, I think with that, there was a conversation that our deck that came up a few months ago around finance, and just like, we're just taking money from our district schools, and I think that it's not directly related to this scenario, but I think it's in there, this like suspicion, well, if they're getting all this money from this private foundation and they're taking all the money from our schools, I think, I know this is jumping ahead to a recommendation, but is there further education on the DAC that's needed of just how does funding for charters actually, come to be, and what goes into it? What are some other, if we want to move off of the observations, unless there's more questions and or recommendations that folks have after reading this scenario?
I know for some of my experience in helping DACs understand the rubric and sort of pointing them back into their lane and helping them understand what the rubric means and what they are looking for and should be, or what they're evaluating, so that to kind of re-ground them in and advise them on moving back into that lane is one of the recommendations or one of the components that I've worked with DACs on to help sort of buffer this and take some of the external kind of components that they're wanting to focus on out of the conversation to some degree.
I will add too, I'm a little biased because I think sometimes DACs need more training than they get up front, and just sort of educating them before they get to the process of looking at their proposal so that they don't get off on the wrong track. Because it's hard once people have sort of dug into a position that feel like they're defending their community.
Other thoughts or questions from Anybody online or elsewhere?
I think like one other push I would have for the DAC now in this district is we need to have better representation of folks from all of our schools, and if we don't have any charter, members on it, we need to look into that.
It's also fair to point out that we have a bunch of districts that deal with a charter application for the first time. So there is no charter experience in their community, so.
Fair enough, yeah.
But almost all the districts that are going to deal with an application have one already.
And I think, in the end, value of the application. But the other stuff. What's the application?
Let's move on to scenario 2. And as before, let's take a few minutes. Everyone can read through the second scenario, and then we'll come back together. Back for about 30 seconds. What are observations in scenario 2? What's sticking out with folks? Concerns?
One observation I have up front is the reason a lot of people get involved in charter schools is because they want their kids to go there. So I think we should kind of acknowledge that as sort of a given. I'd be curious as to whether other folks feel that that's a conflict of interest. I think we sure entertain that discussion, but given what the ground rules are in terms of starting new charters, there are an awful lot of steering committees and ultimately a lot of boards who start that school because they want their kids to go there. Thoughts about that before we tackle the second part, which is a little stickier?
Yeah, I've seen that even in a traditional school. I have, parents of friends of my kids that said, well, we're going to join the PTA, whatever it's called at their school, so X, Y, and Z, which, neither here nor there, nor do I think it gets them in much further, but I'm just saying, I think that mindset and then inclination often comes into play.
I think that there's a difference though if they are considering being employed or have already applied to be employed at a school. And in which case they're trying to participate in governance decisions about their actual employer.
I wonder a little bit about the conflict of interest, not so much that that the reason that we ask that charter representatives be part of the DAC is so that they have internal knowledge of, be it their kids attend a charter or some other pieces, So they have internal knowledge of how charters work, or understanding of charters. However, is there a conflict of interest? I think, Alex, you were wondering about that as well with regards to being an employee. Now, this person isn't yet an employee, but they're interested in becoming one for a very specific reason. So I have questions around, and moving into the questions component around, does this district have a conflict of interest agreement and confidentiality agreement with their DAC members? And would this fall under that? But you would want to have some sort of formal process potentially.
And I also wonder too, I guess it doesn't say it explicitly in this scenario, if that specific charter is of exactly like if they're up for renewal or application. So I guess I'm wondering, I think within that conflict of interest, if there's nothing being done with that charter contractually, but they're still on the DAC, is there, what do you do then? And I think personal experience, like we have a DAC member in our district who's also a board president for a charter. And so like, I mean, that's a very real conflict of interest in a sense. But she's not going to have anything to do with that charter's renewal. So.
Yeah, I was gonna say the hypothetical situation I'm remembering from 10 years ago was actually an expansion of an existing school to have a high school. And so these are current students or current parents of kids in the school who are aides at the school that is also applying to expand to provide a high school. That's why it came to mind.
What about the second part, as Tom said, the potentially stickier part, observations on that?
Are we assuming that the district's policy was adopted prior to the school application? Okay, so we're assuming that. So we're assuming that the district non-discrimination policy was in place at the time that the charter school applied.
This is Max from DPS again. I think in this, my inclination is almost always to essentially advise the DAC on how the district would account for or consider this information, knowing that the state board has recently upheld a district's decision to, consider a school trying to waive out a policy as something that either could be denied over or a district could require that a school follow its policy. So I think I would just, share as much information with the DAC in terms of how the district has to consider this information.
I also wonder a little bit about the districts and the district board of education, how they it's a policy, but I know that different districts sometimes have stated their philosophy to some degree on what is important to them as a district and as a community, what is important and how and then align their policy to those components and how that may inform this piece, if this is an important component of their process, of their policy.
And I would add two contrasting interpretations. One is that if the community has made it a big deal to adopt their policy and said this is an important principle for us as a community, then the standard of appeal getting back to they determine this is in the community interest makes sense. You have to weigh that with the fact that the whole idea of the charter school sector is for people to disagree about stuff that their community has gone in one direction on. But then you have to decide whether discrimination against LGBTQ kids is one of those things where we can politely disagree, or a community priority and principle that they're going to hold to for everybody.
When I think about not providing a replacement plan, this is something my district went through before I was with them, where not this exact scenario, but a charter just said we wanted to waive all of the policies, but we're not ready to provide what those replacement policies would be. And so I think that was just a deal breaker.
I think we could certainly ask the school to provide a replacement policy up front, as we would with other waivers, and then we send those over to Paula, and she tells us whether it's okay or not.
I would also add that that also depends on whether you have an 18-month or 8-month cycle. And so 18 months out, they may not have a replacement plan, and they may say, oh, it's too early. We're working on it, and you don't know what to do for the vote. Or you could be 8 months out when it's too late to not know what the answer is.
Other thoughts from folks online about this?
I think we've time for one more scenario. We'll see something else.
I was just going to say, from my advising districts, I do think it's helpful to have officially thought through the conflict of interest aspect of the DAC. And that since they already have a statutory thing to get someone with experience on, and they also can be in small communities where it's, pretty nested relationships are going on, it can become problematic when someone has a documented connection to the applicant. And then everybody else sort of brings question about what's motivating the positions. So if you can predict that that's a reasonable thing to happen in a small community, then I think it's the kind of thing that we want a policy about, so that you're not fighting over the right for that person to participate.
All right, I think we have time for one more scenario. Take a minute to read this one. Right, once you get to a point where you've read through it and have some observations, go ahead and come off mute just in the interest of time. We've got 5 minutes left. I think one observation I can start us off with is earlier we had mentioned about going to the state board and it becoming part of the record. I mean, I think a concern is even just at a lower level, at the district level. What does that mean if the DAC is up there saying one thing and the district team is saying another thing? I think that's just my observation of the eroding in trust in the process. And it's not that everybody has to agree, but at least having some sort of like united front and maybe presenting why there might be different recommendations if you do have a DAC giving a true recommendation of a yes or no. Because I think that can create a lot of risk in having that happen at a local school board meeting prior to any appeal happening.
Another observation is just thinking through, does your DAC provide recommendations to your board? Or are they providing input around, strengths and concerns? It might be something to think about within your process.
I think this is also one that's sort of conditioned on how sophisticated and functional your DAC is in the first place. So if they understand the difference between an SPF and an CSPF or something, then you can have more in-depth discussions. Otherwise, you got like 4 hours of training to do to really dive into explain the data that's going on.
So just stay in your lane aspect, the chair or the DAC is expecting to nominate points or conditions, so that's interesting. The other issue is that's based on previous recommendations, which is irrelevant to what's really happening here. Stay in your lane again, focus on the current application. It's nice that you're starting to think about training DAC members. Sounds like you did with an idea a year or two prior.
And assuming this is a renewal, it is the application that they're focusing on, and part of the application, you would hope they would include, the looking at the term of the charter and what has happened, right? So it's not mutually exclusive. However, looking, citing, helping them go back to that rubric and what they're actually looking at, and the information provided within the application, it would hopefully cover that, right?
Yeah, one thought recommendation I have too is that the district AEC, I mean, I think like trying to stay focused on the task at hand, which is the renewal for the charter AEC. And since it's putting it back on them, is they need to demonstrate what they're doing as far as outcomes for kids. And it might, rather than trying to, like, not even thinking about the district AEC, they need to present their case of, are they getting outcomes for kids? And if you don't see that in the data, how else can it demonstrate that? If they think it's happening somewhere else. I think that that's a recommendation of just trying to keep DAC and the district teams focused on the charter versus the district AEC. We can't compare those two. Just focus on what the charter AEC is doing or not doing.
One thing I'm looking forward to sharing with more CACSA members, right, speaking to that point, is the A-Games data set. So the A-Game is a national effort looking at alternative education campuses and their performance. And they have a large data set of AECs nationally where you can compare and say, what is the 7-year grad rate of AECs, and figure out, have a much bigger sample than just the districts of it. I do think AECs are really hard for school boards because once you try to hold them accountable, they can always present some very compelling human interest stories on a small percentage of their population. And that's really hard politically for school boards to deal with if there's really unacceptable performance anyway. They're really politicized.
That's fine for this. Any last thoughts on this scenario?
I just wonder about having conversations with the DAC chair around, perceived components, in helping them understand that they don't get to write conditions, but they have to evaluate the application as is. And then, their expectation and sort of helping them understand that they, would want to focus on the current and not previous experiences or information from the previous recommendation from the DAC.
Everybody putting their thought, is there a we're putting the heads together and thinking through considerations for DACs.
And I will post, if I can't get it up right now, I'll post along with the notes, the links to the recordings for the different sessions and the materials for each one that we had.
And really quickly, Paula is going to put the link to our, what is it called again? Survey. I was like, our evaluation, our survey, and we would really love to get your feedback on the authorizers meeting for today. So we very much appreciate that. Bill, any parting words for today?
Just that the number one highlight for me today was seeing someone in person. So it feels like we're getting back to a little bit more of that human element. Not that the technology isn't great. It is, and it's great to have everyone here. But just the opportunity to connect with people is really nice. And I heard a lot of rich conversation today. I'm really grateful for that. And I think it's just so exciting. I know I haven't really been in this for super long, but to see the level of collaboration and connection and dialogue that's happening among operators and finding practice is really exciting. As we embark on the next 2 days of engagement with schools, it's nice to kick things off with our operations.
And just from CACSA, I just want to reiterate how great it is to see you in person that are able to be here today. And we look forward to having more of that. And I really do think that Authorizing is often a siloed task within districts, and it's great to have a professional community. And I really think the personal side of that community is rich and something we need to build into. So the more we can put into it together, the more we'll get out of it together. And we hope to do more of that. At CACSA.
Well, thank you, Alex. And thanks again, everybody, for being here and being part of this excellent authorizers meeting. And we'll see some of you tomorrow and the next day at our conference. So take care, everybody. And thanks for your feedback. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Briefly in that.